Right, okay, well, good morning once again, everyone. Croeso nôl. Thank you very much for joining us for this Ask the Expert session. Croeso nôl i'r grŵp Cymraeg am y sesiwn holi'r arbenigwr. The aim of this session this morning then will be to give our two guests who've kindly agreed to come along and give up some of their Saturday to talk about their experiences of inclusion and their perspectives towards inclusion. So I will give Kate and Lucy an opportunity to introduce themselves shortly, and then we'll get going with the discussion. But hopefully you'll see a couple of things as we go through the discussion this morning. One of them is we've set up a range of different questions that Lucy and Kate are going to answer. And in terms of some of the discussion points that are going to come out, hopefully you'll be able to make the links between what's been discussed today and different things that you might be talking about within your assignments that we introduced earlier on. So, for example, different types of strategies, what might different perspectives of inclusion be, what might different barriers to or benefits of inclusion look like, and thinking about different context. I'll let Lucy and Kate give you their particular context shortly, but again, I think it's interesting just going back to that Mentimeter poll that we talked about earlier on, where those of you attending today, for example, noted of the options given, which ones you kind of most closely identified with in terms of your setting. And just to kind of let you know, in terms of those, there were 15 people who identified working in primary school, 10 in secondary, 4 in an all-through school, so 3 to 16 or 3 to 19. 3 people they noted worked in a special school setting, 1 in an alternative provision setting, 3 in FE, 2 in HE, and 1 in a local authority. So I think that very short snap poll this morning, in addition to Lucy and Kate joining us today, shows very much that inclusion is everyone's business, and it doesn't necessarily relate to just one type of setting or age or stage of learners that you might be working with. So that's enough of a kind of preamble from me to introduce the session. So I'm going to work through a range of questions that Kate and Lucy have seen in advance. And the first question is, could you please give us an overview of your setting and your role within it? And I think this is to Lucy first.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Morning, Di. Nice to see you all again. So I'm Lucy Morgan, and I am a senior assistant head teacher in a special school. So I work with learners aged 3 to 19. So I've got quite a wide range of learners in Paris. So it's a very small kind of area from what I'm used to. I'm a Cardiff girl, so I'm used to working in Cardiff and the Vale, but actually moved over to Paris about 3 years ago, where I am a senior leader as an assistant head teacher. My role is quite varied, like a bit of inclusive, I would say. I'd say that I spent a lot of time the last 2 years building up skill development around care support and guidance, if you look at it from like the SDN hat, where I look at real whole school behaviour approaches, well-being, emotional support, etc. And my role also then looks at teaching and learning. So I work with the TLRs to adapt our curriculum so that it meets the needs of the learner, because whilst it's great to have a new curriculum for Wales, they forgot about the learners who are working below progression step 1. So that is my job, is to look at teaching and learning and curriculum development for the missing gap, maybe some might say. And then from a leadership point of view then is I also do quite a lot of varied leadership roles within the school, but also for the local authority. So I work on outreach, I work at cluster group meetings, Elenco champion. So I work across my cluster and also across Paris. So I've got quite a varied role. And whilst you might all think, oh, there's a small percentage of people on today that work in special school, actually I'm trained secondary school teacher. So for 10 years, I was in secondary education. Don't know how I ended up where I am today, if I'm honest, but I absolutely love where I am. So I do know what it's like being in a secondary school, head of department there, and lots of results driven, completely different curriculum they want you to look at. I also worked as a TA, learning all about ALM. when I first went into ALM, because I didn't know what the difference was between ASD, ADHD, PMLD, all of these different acronyms just threw me. So I've worked there, and I had to change my practice completely in special school because now I work in a primary model. So I think that pretty much covers a lot of variety of people on today. So I really do empathise and understand what inclusion looks like in lots of different settings, and got some advice and support. Hopefully you might be able to get some things out of it. And I'm looking at it from those lenses today with Kate, from a special school setting, from a primary model, and from kind of a secondary model, a bit more on the ground and what that looks like from a leadership point of view.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy. And same question then to Kate, please. What's your setting and what's your role within it?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Kate Phillips, and I'm head of the Vulnerable Learners Service in Swansea Council. So Vulnerable Learners Service is quite a broad service area. There's three main teams that I'm responsible for. So the first one is our pupil referral unit. We have quite a large pupil referral unit in Swansea. There's 159 places. And it's quite a diverse setting, covering social emotional health and well-being, but also SEBD. So a really kind of mixed cohort, and we've done quite a lot of work in recent times on reviewing that provision and trying to kind of address some of the current challenges that schools and colleagues are experiencing, and also really meeting the changing needs of children and young people. So that's one area. The second area is a team called the Learner Engagement Team. So that's a really diverse team. We cover school admissions, we cover attendance, support for exclusions, although we prefer to call it inclusion, so preventing exclusions, education, safeguarding and child protection, children looked after, education, and then we also have a early intervention and prevention team within that broader team. So that's quite a busy area of work. And then the third area is the central ALN and inclusion team. So that covers our specialist teachers, educational psychology service, planning for specialist places, including, we call them SDFs in Swansea, resource bases, I think they're known in other authorities, and our special schools. So it's quite a broad role. It's mainly strategic. It's mainly around policy development and implementation, and ensuring our kind of whole authority approach to inclusion. But I think similarly to Lucy, my background is I'm a secondary teacher by trade, but I had very much a kind of pick and mix education career. So I've been a EAL advisory teacher, where I worked from the nursery through to secondary, so 3 to 16. I've sat on the floor in the nursery classroom. It's really hard work. That's, I think, that one of the toughest jobs. I've worked with the Otis learners myself. I've been a teacher on outreach, the Otis outreach programs. So been in the YMCA on a Friday afternoon back in the day, trying to keep young lads engaged in things that they didn't particularly want to be engaged in. So kind of experience some of those challenges firsthand. And I really hope that informs my practice, because I think sometimes when you get into a more strategic leadership role, it's difficult sometimes to remember what it's like on the ground. So I hope that I try to do that. It's difficult as well, because of course my role is very much around balancing resources and resource allocation. So that can be quite difficult in terms of decision making. But we always try and take a learner-centred approach, and that's really the principles that we adhere to wherever possible. So that's me and my role.
Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr both. So just listening to Kate and Lucy introducing themselves and their settings there, I'm sure you can understand why we are so delighted that they've been able to attend today, in terms of being able to offer discussion through different lenses and those different levels of practice. Now, before I go on and ask the next question, there was one thing that I forgot to say at the start, which was if anyone today does have any questions that you'd like to direct towards Lucy and Kate later on, there's two options. One of them is you can pop them in the chat and we'll monitor those as we go through. And secondly, if Lucy and Kate are happy to do so, we could open it up for a brief Q&A and people can pop along and ask their questions verbally if they want to as well. Fab. So moving on with the rest of the questions then. So this next question very much will relate to what people have been talking about in their first breakout room this morning, which is, can you please tell us what inclusive practice means to you? And I'm going to open that up to you, Kate, first of all, please.
Thank you. So I didn't say, but I'm not sure if people are aware, Lucy and I are both on the doctoral programme. So we've been undertaking research. We're in the middle of planning our research proposals. And my research is around exactly that kind of question. What is inclusive practice? How do we define it? So for me, one of the most powerful things that I had ever seen was shared by a parent, and it's a cartoon. It's on YouTube by Jeff Spink, and it talks about the social model of disability, and it's quite short, about 7 minutes. I recommend watching it, and it was really impactful because it made me really think about flipping the lens around how we put children, people at the centre of our decision making, rather than trying to get people to fit into our systems and into our schools. So it's about really we talk a lot about children being, are they ready for school? But actually, are schools ready for children? So it's about really thinking about changing continually, about looking at the children and young people in front of us and thinking, if something's not working for them, what do we have to do differently? Not what do children have to do differently? So as part of my research, as kind of as a starting point, I looked at the Salamanca Statement, which was a kind of internationally agreed position on inclusive education, and they talk very clearly about schools for all, about what we do in terms of creating a system that it means that everybody's individual needs is met. And there's a lot of work done on that at, kind of national, regional level around relationships, belonging, engagement, and that's very much kind of what my everyday work is around. So it's not necessarily around separating children out to provide something extra for them, but rather thinking about how do we really kind of create that sense where every child belongs, every child's supported to become engaged, and every child feels part of a provision, and that provision is really kind of central to meeting their needs. So inclusion really should become the norm rather than something that we do extra or additional. That's not to be naive enough to not recognise that comes with massive challenges. And operationally that can be really, really difficult. And I think Lucy's going to talk a bit, when we were discussing yesterday how we'd kind of share the session, she's going to talk in response to this about some of those operational challenges. And that's really part of what I'm trying to do with my research, is try and work out how we kind of can manage those really aspirational and highly principled ethos of inclusion and make that achievable within the kind of constraints of current practice, which is challenging. So that, but in terms of, my vision for inclusion, it's absolutely around, learner centered, everyone belongs, everyone's engaged, and our responsibility as professionals is to facilitate that happening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. You started to mention there some of the professional development that you are personally engaging within at the moment. With your permission, we'll come back to that at the end of the session, if that's okay. But thank you very much for introducing us at that point. Really like the point you made about inclusion being seen as the norm rather than something that we should be thinking about adding on for some learners. So, diolch yn fawr, Kate. Same question then over to Lucy.
Yes, I've looked at it kind of from two different hats, really. So first of all, I probably shouldn't be here speaking to you because if we really looked at an inclusive society, there wouldn't be any specialist schools, therefore I wouldn't be having a job role. So actually in society, my view is if we do it right, then our specialist provision in Wales wouldn't exist, because actually everybody should be working in this kind of respect. My own personal opinion based on that, though, is everybody has got kind of quirks and something about them in our own particular lives. Everyone needs to have our environments changed to suit our own needs, etc. Therefore, we should accept everybody in the way that we are. And I certainly think throughout my career, kind of my morals and my stance are very, very strong. And I think as leaders, as future leaders, as people who are leading young minds of today, we kind of need to know where we stand, because if we're modelling what inclusivity looks like in the classroom from our own perspective, I think that will really come across to learners as well, and it will certainly affect your practice. So I very much stand in everybody's got quirks, so therefore why are we talking about inclusivity? We're just talking about what it is I need to be able to manage this environment. But again, not naive like Kate. It's really hard as well when you're a leader trying to get that message across to everybody, because everybody's got their own views, their own backgrounds, their own way they've been brought up, and they've got their vision of what that is. So kind of finding a benchmark of where your staff are is something that I think is really important, but also setting the standards where you are as well, using the literature, but your own personal views and living that message. In terms of some challenges as well, I'm just going to touch upon this basically is you've got to remember that the policies that it's kind of Claire, Kate and kind of the local authority look at, we've got to also adhere to those policies and what inclusivity looks like across different counties, etc. They may all differ. We also got to look at, for example, the views of the child, what they feel is fine. Working in a secondary placement is very different around inclusivity. You've got lots of different personalities you've got to negotiate. I'm not naive to think about that. And also about the staff, their capabilities, the training that you're going to implement those. There's lots of things to kind of to consider when you are thinking about your own definition, but actually standing firm in where you feel your morals lie and making sure that they align to everything as well as educators, and you're modelling those to other people, I think is where I'd stand on that question.
Thank you, Lucy, and I think you raised a couple of really good points there in terms of where do we see the type of placement in terms of inclusion, and also really nice in terms of regardless of role, regardless of responsibility, potentially we can all model and lead inclusive practice within our own particular settings. So the next question then is quite a long-winded question, and so it's a good job that you've had this in advance. So what we're going to ask you to think a little bit about next is, could you please share an example or examples of strategies that you might have used previously to support inclusion, which have been successful, however that success might have been measured, and linked to that maybe as well is, what do you consider to be good or effective inclusive practice? So I think I'm coming to Lucy first in terms of this one.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of something that I set up. So they were a group of learners. There was only about 10 learners that they were not in education for 5 years. And I set up something called a provision called the Horizon, which is based at Ysgol which were for learners who were just in the community, able to access GCSE, but for some reason school just wasn't working for them. And I was given a room and no criteria other than get them back into education. So by October half term, we got them back into education, and by hook or by crook, they were in full time. And I said, well, what are we going to do with them now? But, you know, they're back in. What's the plan? So we literally went as staff out and taught ourselves different various subjects, got some experts in. And ultimately, by the end of that kind of summer term, all of those learners in that provision left with at least 6 GCSEs and above and transitioned into a college setting. So when I look at that provision, I'm really, really proud of that provision. The team and I worked really, really hard, worked with senior leaders, and I was, you know, kind of making some strategic decisions as well. But actually, when I asked the learners, what is it that made this different? Why were you coming back into school full time? I can't even tell you about some of the experiences that they had, because one of the learners, for example, even revisited their old school and gave a speech to them about what it is they need to look at for themselves as children and as staff. And I was so proud about them. And I knuckled it down to these kind of 3 enablers that the Welsh Government describe. And actually, they've hit the nail on the head. What we made within that provision is we made an enabling environment. You know, we set up a classroom where we were taking photographs of things that they were achieving. We were putting them on the wall and we were celebrating success. And actually, that enabling environment, which just provided us with a space that we developed. We got outside, we were digging gardens together, and actually we were building relationships. So that enabling environment, I think, was somewhere where we started. And then the enabling adults that I had working alongside me, they changed their practice, and they changed their practice as they started listening to learners, listening to their experiences, and responding to what was really in front of us. That for us changed practice from adults, and I'd like to think those enabling adults have gone away and continued their practice in terms of listening to those kind of learners and being really actually inclusive, because we looked at the child holistically. We met their parents, their families, we sat with health, we got CAMS in, we explained to CAMS where their missing gap was, we held a big lunch with all the healthcare professionals. We really understood those learners and put them very much at the centre, and those adults were really part of that journey. And then that enabling experiences or engaging experience, I think the Welsh Government referred to it as, was the last thing. We really listened to ways in which we were delivering our curriculum, and our teaching and learning got adapted. So I learned Minecraft and we taught biology through Minecraft, because they were saying sessions where you talk and chalk at me is not going to help. And actually, for everybody, we had A stars, A's and B's. We had to fight with local colleges to say these learners are really creative. They had no form of data previously to that because they hadn't attended for school. To leave with A stars, A's and B's was phenomenal to be able to go on. And I think they just really showed me as a practitioner how you just shouldn't put kind of a value or a limit on anybody. You just need to provide those three things: an enabling environment, an enabling adult, enabling experiences, and really holistically look at that pupil from every aspect of their life. So for me, that was a really successful story, and I've used those three things to base my strategic decisions around school. So what do our classroom environments look like? What do our adults look like? And what experiences we provide for children? And they really are things that, again, sit within my moral compass and are driving things forward.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lucy. That's a lovely example, and you might have seen some virtual rounds of applause going on whilst you were talking about that as well. But really nice points about the enabling environment, enabling adults, enabling experiences, getting to know those learners on a holistic level. And I think a key thing that came out there as well was actually hearing that learner's voice, which is something you've both mentioned this morning, and giving them the opportunity. Aspirations come through there as well as celebrating success. So Diolch, thank you for sharing. So same question then over to Kate.
Thank you. So my response is slightly different because my role is more around kind of, strategy and policy. So one of the things that we've done recently is to devise an inclusion strategy for the whole local authority area. And what that's really around is thinking about how we can support our schools and settings strategically to embed approaches such as those that Lucy's talked about. So we recognise that there's like so much good practice that happens, but sometimes it's very hard to kind of find that or have that in a cohesive system. So one of the elements of our inclusion strategy that we've looked at is developing in-reach outreach approaches. So when Lucy talked earlier at the beginning around, if we had a truly inclusive system, you wouldn't necessarily have a special school or specialist resource bases or SDFs. The reality is, of course, that, we do need those, and there is a place for them at the moment. But what we're trying to do is shift the thinking around to bringing the specialists out into local schools, into home schools, into communities, rather than removing children and taking them to a more specialist setting. So we've developed a few strands to our in-reach outreach projects, and they've had some really positive outcomes and successes. So first of all, our special school, and I think special schools across Wales do this, have quite a well-developed outreach programme. We have some really highly skilled, experienced teachers, teaching assistants working in our special schools. And actually what we've tried to do is to develop this outreach team. So when a mainstream school is perhaps struggling to meet a learner's needs, is kind of thinking, well, what do we do next? We've tried so much, we've gone so far, how do we kind of, work next with this young person? Then our outreach team will go, they'll work with the school staff, they'll focus on building capacity, on upskilling, on really kind of, having a look at the environment, the physical space. And that was something that came out quite strongly then from our special school outreach team, that sometimes some what would appear on the surface to be quite obvious changes to a physical environment could make a really significant difference to learners. So that led us to explore an occupational therapy approach. So looking at commissioning 2 occupational therapists in Swansea who work in 2 different ways. So we have one who works specifically with our specialist settings to really take a look at the environments to see how they can change, flex to better meet learners' needs. And the other is to focus on individual cases. So in a mainstream school, to go in, perhaps look at a classroom setting, perhaps look at how a young person is functioning in that setting, and to see what kind of changes to the physical environment can be implemented. And they've made it, that's been really well received, and they've made tremendous differences in terms of really kind of enabling those environments that best meet learners' needs and give them the opportunity to really thrive in those settings. So that's been really positive. I just touch on two further projects linked to the in-reach outreach approaches. And it was really important that we referred to them as in-reach and outreach, because we wanted a bit of both. We wanted to make sure that where there was a need for something a bit extra, that was available. So we've spent the last 18 months piloting something that we call a cluster enhanced provision in one of our clusters in Swansea. So we had a primary school that had a very high level of expertise, and they had a specialist teaching facility, and they were really kind of a bit of a guiding light, if you like, in terms of inclusion. Really fantastic practice there. And what we were finding was lots of families were wanting to choose that school over other local schools, or children were kind of, being suggested that they would maybe want to transfer there. So actually what that, and there was really, as an example of really strong cluster working, what the cluster set up with support from a local authority was an enhanced base where children very much belonged to their home school, but they could access that base for a set number of days a week. And then staff from that school would go back to their home school on usually a Friday, it happened, and they would work then with the home school to say, look at the strategies that worked for this child here. This is how we can help you to change your provision. This is how this can, we can kind of support this young person to have their needs met within their home community school. And then really kind of, going back to that sense of belonging, that sense of the ownership and responsibility for children. And the consequence of that is 18 children have now been had access to that provision, and we've been able to track those children back. And whereas previously we think all 18 would have been referred for a specialist provision, 16 of them have been able to remain in their mainstream school and have really settled and have really started to make really strong progress. 2 have been referred on to a specialist provision, and we kind of recognise that's really what they need. But we know that we've really satisfied ourselves that was the right approach, and it's really helped home schools to kind of upskill themselves. And then the final approach in relation to the in-reach outreach is our sensory resource base. So moving away from specialist provisions for children with hearing impairment or a visual impairment, and actually having specialists who will go work with them in their schools and their local communities. They become quite isolated in a specialist provision, but they can also become isolated in a mainstream school. So the in-reach bit is that they have that base that exists, they can access with their families. You run community events there, but they are educated within their local mainstream school. Specialist support goes out to them, but we also have a specialist base where they can come and have some very tailored provision and community activity. So I think that's it.
That's great, thank you very much. And again, some really nice in-depth discussion there in terms of different strategies, perhaps at more of a strategic level. Some really good points in terms of maybe flipping that narrative in terms of taking the expertise out towards the learners rather than bringing learners into expertise, for example. And really nice recognition to know what there is really good practice, there is really effective practice going on in schools. How do we share and make this more widely known and celebrated? So, dear Howard, thank you very much. So the next question then is going to pick up on something that people have been talking about in their breakout rooms to some extent this morning, which is about the benefits of inclusive practice. So in terms of the question, what do you see as being the benefits of inclusive practice? And do you have any examples other than those you've already shared, perhaps, of these benefits from your own setting or experience? And I think I'm coming to Kate first.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I guess in some respects, my answer to this kind of builds on the previous answer to the previous question. So in terms of the benefits of inclusive practice, I really see them as like whole system benefits. And that's probably linked somewhat to my kind of like more strategic view, but I see that inclusion is really like a cradle to grave issue. So it's about an approach to the whole person, and it's an approach for the whole system, the resources of the whole system to make that happen. So it's about how we engage all services. So it's not just the responsibility of schools, but there's also engagement with third sector, with social care, with other agencies. But we have to enable that to happen. So it's not, that doesn't happen by coincidence. So I think when we look at some of the issues that are really prevalent in terms of preventing inclusion, so children being excluded from schools, for example, children not attending schools, those answers don't rest solely with a school, but they do rest with a system that kind of is committed to never giving up on those children and young people. And that's why we have a real focus on prevention and early intervention. So it's kind of our approach is very much about preventing an escalation to needing a statutory service or a statutory intervention. So getting in as early as possible. I spoke at the beginning of my experience working in nursery classes, you know, and the kind of that fundamental foundation stage for children where they're in that really early developmental process is so critical in terms of preventing perhaps difficulties, challenges, issues arising later on. And I think really kind of recognizing the importance of that and not seeing all of our different bits and different roles as being kind of standalone, but rather that we all contribute together to an inclusive system. So I think it's about a kind of collective ownership, a collective responsibility. Inclusion, I said earlier, is not something that's additional or something that's extra. It's absolutely kind of, you know, everybody's responsibility, but in a very, very kind of, you know, it should be in a very deeply embedded way. And then what you see in, if you look at youth justice service data or prison data, the number of people who are in those systems who have either identified speech and language need or a neurodiverse dyslexia or ADHD are disproportionately represented. And if we recognise that we have a responsibility at the earliest stages to prevent that from happening, to prevent that escalation, then that really kind of evidences the benefit of an inclusive system, because we're stopping people spiralling into further challenge or difficulty. So I think in terms of something that we've done, one of our prevention and early intervention strategies when children are at risk of kind of, you know, disengagement and coming out of an education system earlier than we would hope. Our early intervention and prevention team really work very closely to pick up those children and young people and put together very, very bespoke packages of education and support for them. So similarly to the approach that Lucy talked about earlier. So for example, we've had some young people work in our local market. They've been given work experience. They were children who were at high risk of exclusion from school. They've really thrived in that environment, and they've been kind of, you know, held up as real examples of excellent employees. We hold every year an inclusion conference in Swansea, and two of those young people came to speak at our last conference, and they talked about, the title of their presentation was What I Was Trying to Tell You But Couldn't. So they were talking about when they were in school and they were having these very kind of, you know, behaviours that were perceived as being very challenging. What they were actually saying was, I'm struggling to engage in this. I don't understand it. I don't really know what's going on. This is not meeting my needs. Actually, what was going to meet their needs was something that in this case was more practical, that recognised their skill set, that gave them a real value. And they were able to come and talk very articulately to an art, which I can't, and to an audience of about 100 head teachers, deputy head teachers, about their experiences. And yet kind of 2 years previously they were at high risk of being permanently excluded from schools. One of them's actually gone on to work in a school now as the caretaker. So really kind of positive outcomes, but it's that whole system collective responsibility, never giving up, seeing it that this is something that is really valuable, that every individual has got a purpose and has got a skill set, and it's about how we tap into that and engage that interest. And yeah, that's what I would say is the benefits of an inclusive education system.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Kate. And some clear benefits you've mentioned there, and that was a nice lens to look at it through in terms of that whole system and thinking about a whole system being supportive of inclusion. And some of those points you'd picked up on, like, is the responsibility for all, thinking about what we put into identification and prevention, for example, again, chime in quite well in terms of legislation and policy within Wales as well. So we've heard about that on a system level. So I'm going to pass over then to Lucy. So what do you see as being the benefits of inclusive practice, and any examples you're happy to share from your practice or setting?
Yeah, so I'm looking at it from a completely different lens from the learner who arrives at our door on the first day. They've been through quite a lot of systems to be able to get to us in the first instance. And I looked at it from even like our kind of limited verbal communication pupils, other pupils who've got PMLD, who can't tell us verbally how they feel, but they certainly have got a family behind them or a network of people behind them. So for me, a benefit is that networking with really trying to understand the needs of learners. So you don't know what type of sleep they've had that night. You don't know what their diet looks like. Some of them are potentially in slips. They're not continent, maybe. They might have some issues that need physiotherapy. So for us, when you see that learner, you kind of invest in the family as a community. So I think a huge benefit is that, like Kate mentioned, the networking, to be able to really unpick what it is that learner really needs. And how you can get their best quality of life. I use quite a lot of quality of life index and tools just to measure what it looks like from when the learner walks through the door to when the learner leaves school. What provision can we provide for that learner to make them as inclusive in our community as possible and have the best quality of life as possible? So for some learners, it might just be a case of that whole day is I've got out of my chair, I've moved, I have completed my physiotherapy exercises, I've engaged with adults, I've engaged with my peers, I've had fun, and actually that is their curriculum. And I think people almost devalue some of the outcomes that those learners have that we see within our specialist provision, because the benefits that they have from the provision and from that kind of community feel together is quite significant. So for me, as kind of a practitioner, this network is a huge benefit, but also special schools are really good at sticking together as well. We've got quite a big network called SWASH. We've got one in the north and one in the south, where South Wales special schools come together on a regular basis and they literally talk about where the missing gaps are, where good practice is. I could phone anybody in a different special school setting and say, look, I've got a learner coming in today. I just don't know where to go with them. And they become experts as well. And we're very good in special schools at sharing expertise to find out exactly what it is that learner needs to move on to get them the best quality of life. And I think we're quite lucky in that setting. Working in Paris, we've got the local cluster groups as well. So I'm delivering some sessions next week with the local cluster groups about what I have found, because I've gone out and investigated myself, invested in what is we need and how that could be used within our local cluster. I think that is really important. So that kind of model as schools of learning organisations, again, is a really great Welsh Government initiative. It almost gives you the green light to say, go and look within your school setting, go and look beyond your school setting, go and look nationally. And this has really helped us to be able to do that and network. And I think, yeah, that's kind of it really from it. From I can talk to you a lot about kind of how you can measure that as well. Just because somebody isn't necessarily verbal, you can look at lots of different cues. Things like Leuven scales are used within our schools to look at engagement and enjoyment within sessions. Try and find different ways of getting voices and different strategies to capture the voice of learners as well, I would say. And definitely networking with others would be really huge benefits around this kind of inclusive practices.
Thank you very much, dear Lucy. So very interesting to kind of compare and contrast those different levels, strategic to the individual learner, between yourself and Kate in the discussion. I thought you raised some excellent points. I really loved that phrase, what we do is we invest in the family and we invest within the community. And I thought that was a key point as well. Sometimes do we always value those non-academic outcomes as much as academic, because they are significant and they do impact upon quality of life for those learners. So thank you very much. So we've talked a little bit then about strategies that have been successful. We've talked a little bit about the benefits on very different scales. So the next question, and I think I'm coming to you first with this one, Lucy, is flipping that a little bit. So very often we try things in settings and they don't always work. So do you have an example of a strategy that you might have used within a setting to support inclusion that for whatever reason wasn't quite as successful as you hoped it might have been?
Yes, so one of the area of expertise I'm focusing on, and I'll come back to that when I talk to you about my ideas. I really look at behaviours that challenge within school settings. You can imagine I've got lots of unsuccessful strategies I can discuss with you today. In particular, trying to use a catch and match strategy that I learned from a trauma-informed approach with a pupil and ended up really feeling the repercussions from that afterwards. So I guess I can give you lots of on the ground operational things that will happen directly with learners. But actually what I think I came as a result of that is not being afraid to kind of try them out and making mistakes. And I would definitely say to anybody on here is go and try it out. And if it doesn't work, it might not have worked in that moment. It might work again later on at a later date, or it might work with a different pupil. And I think about making mistakes. You learn more from making mistakes than you do if it's always successful. So I can talk to you lots about like kind of operational things, but actually my other kind of moral compass is I expect staff in my school to co-regulate and co-educate at the same time. So from a challenging behaviour perspective, it might be that you've got a pupil in that class who really is causing a huge amount of disruption to learning. And I keep coming back to, yeah, but why? There's always a reason behind it. There's always, what is the understanding of that? It's really hard in a secondary school when you've got 50 minutes trying to unpick the whys behind it. So you need to almost become upskilled in successful strategies and be upskilled in unsuccessful strategies as well, I think, from that point of view. But as you can imagine, my co-regulate and co-educate at the same time motto doesn't necessarily always sit well with my staff, because hang on a minute, you're expecting us to produce X, Y, Z outcomes, but also you're expecting us to understand X, Y, Z things about that learning. Yes, I am. I am expecting to do those things. So along the way, I have been met with lots of unsuccessful strategies from resilience. And I think Kate's going to talk to you a bit more about this, is about making sure that you work together with the people who are around that child is really important. MDTs are really important. Don't think you've always got the right answers. Don't think you always are the expert. Don't think you always need to fix something. You're just one person, you might not necessarily know about. For example, somebody who might be selective mute. Have that MDT approach to make a lot of the strategy successful, but also encourage your staff to do so too. Encourage those adults around you, because if you model, it might be a great example of, and it might not have worked now, but actually let's persevere with this. It takes 2,000 practices of one skill, of one strategy to learn a new skill. So why are we expecting learners to get it right first time? Why are we expecting that strategy to be right first time? We've also talking about children potentially with learning difficulties on top of that. We're giving them 20% extra time in an exam, so give them 20% more extra time in terms of strategies. So I think perseverance as well is really, really part of, I'd say, in the past, people would say unsuccessful strategies, and I would say it could be successful strategies if you just use that perseverance. I think that's kind of where I am, and handing over a bit more to Kate, I think.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So some really nice points there in terms of resilience, perseverance, both in terms of staff engaging with strategies, but also in terms of supporting our learners to develop those. And I thought that was a nice phrase, don't be afraid to try. It might not have worked now, but it doesn't mean it's not going to work in the future. And I like the flip you tried to put at the end there. Maybe these strategies we're talking about, they're not unsuccessful strategies, they're just not strategies that work in the here and now. So thank you very much. So I'm going to pass over then to Kate, and same question over to you.
Thanks. So yeah, I could probably give you 100 examples of things that I've done that haven't been successful. But when we were talking about it yesterday, Lucy and I was kind of reflecting on the things I actually learned from those experiences, and I thought maybe that would be like a helpful message to share. So similarly to Lucy, really, what I think the key thing that I've learned when things haven't gone well is that it's because I've tried to do something either in isolation or tried to do something to people, perceived as being done to people. I perhaps thought, right, I'm the expert on this, I know what I'm doing, I make it easy for everybody, I'll just do it, and then people can accept this policy, this document, this approach, this strategy. And actually that doesn't work, and it hasn't worked, because people need to be engaged, they need to be valued, they need to be part of that process, and it does take a long time, and it's quite difficult to kind of think, right, okay, we might get to the same outcome actually, but engaging with all the relevant stakeholders, getting people involved in co-design, getting them to collaborate, to pull something together is really critical. So as an example of that, we've just done, we spent quite a lot of time revising our school behaviour policy in Swansea. We call it rights, respect, responsibility. And when we started the work about 2 years ago, I thought, oh, I know what we need to do, and I can write that, and I'll just do that. And then I stopped myself and thought, no, that's fatal. So we engaged in a really quite significant period of collaboration and co-design. We brought all of our stakeholders together. We included, I think the message that I would give to colleagues this morning is parents as well, parent carers as key stakeholders are really critical, particularly in inclusion. I think, you know, hearing their voice, hearing their views, their opinions, how it lands from the other side of the desk, so to speak, is really important. Also really critical to hear the voice of children and young people. So we did quite a lot of work with children, young people stakeholder groups, and trying to hear the quieter voices as well, or the less accessible voices was really important. And really listening to that as well. So not doing it as a kind of tick box, not doing it because it's the kind of the buzzword. It's really about actually listening to what they have to say, hearing it and thinking, right, okay, maybe that's not what I expected, or that's not that's not the easiest path, but actually that's the path that will make a difference if we can really kind of try and incorporate those aspirations that and listen to those views that children and their families have. I think that's really important. I think that the other thing that I would say in relation to that really is about getting people to invest in the process rather than just getting people to buy into it. So they talk about that quite a lot in leadership. And it sounds a bit cheesy sometimes, but I think actually it's a really important message, because there's a difference between kind of it being a bit tokenistic and sort of saying, oh, well, we listen to the stakeholders, and we get to actually making them truly part of that process and truly part of developing that. So, you know, colleagues in schools primarily in the room this morning, I think it's quite a difficult thing. It's quite a difficult thing to do, and it's really time consuming. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but I think, you know, I do feel like it's an investment in kind of making things much more workable in the long run. So I think that's quite important. And Lucy's touched on it as well. The other thing I think I've learned from my mistakes is always ask for help. Never think that you can do it, you know it, or that you shouldn't ask for help because you're bothering people, or that it's somehow a kind of sign of weakness. I think we always say asking for help is a sign of strength. It's a recognition that no one can know everything or do everything, and there are so many skilled and talented people working in education. There'll always be somebody who knows an answer, or has had a different experience, or who can share something with you. And I guess that's that kind of, you know, collaborative approach, and it really works particularly in issues relating to inclusion, because they are really challenging. It's not easy. If it was easy, then, you know, we'd have fixed it all by now, wouldn't we? So I think ask for help, talk to people, genuinely collaborate. That would be my kind of top tips from what I've learned from my mistakes.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I thought that was really nice how you kind of at the end of that discussion kind of answered how to overcome some of the challenges that you found as well. Lots of points you mentioned there kind of went back to the kind of the social model of need and person-centered practice that in groups we've been talking a little bit about this morning. That key bit about listening to the voice of children and their families, doing things with rather than doing to or imposing to on. And I really like that point you made about that difference between investing in and buying into, and how that perhaps informs cultures and ethos within settings. So that's great. So we've talked a little bit about strategies that have been successful. We've talked a little bit about strategies that maybe weren't successful at the time and unpicked why, but also how those might have been learning opportunities going forward as well. We've talked a little bit about the benefits of inclusive practice. So the next question then, and I think Kate, I'm coming to you first with this one, is you've kind of already mentioned, you know what, sometimes this is difficult to do, or this is difficult to embed in practice. So what do you see might be some of the challenges in ensuring or implementing effective inclusive practice?
Sure, thanks. So this is really the kind of crux of the challenge for me, and this is what I'm looking to do some of my research on in my own studying. So really, I think in terms of the main challenge is that we don't have a shared definition. I think we all have a very strong commitment to inclusion and inclusive practice. I think if you talk to any teacher, educator, person working in, this kind of field of work, everybody will express very strongly and very clearly a desire to be inclusive, and that understand that it's a real kind of moral imperative as well as a professional imperative. But I think if you dig a bit deeper and kind of ask for what's the definition of inclusion, then what does it look like? It's quite hard to articulate. It can look different in every setting. It's quite challenging to achieve that consistency across settings. It's challenging for practical reasons because different settings will have different resources, environments, cohorts, staff, experience, and so on. But also different settings have different cultures and ethoses. And I think that some of the things that we've talked about around, that prevention, early intervention, never giving up, they're quite aspirational, and they don't always come with a very clear kind of guidelines around exactly what it looks like. So when we see kind of a baseline, if you like, for inclusion, it can be very different in very different settings. And I talked at the beginning about the Salamanca statement, which was something that I'd kind of looked at the beginning of my research to kind of try and find a definitive definition of inclusion. And it's very aspirational, and it's really, I think, what we would all agree with, but it doesn't actually give us any fixed points to refer back to. And there was a piece of work that was done mapping the literature that's been considered since that statement was written. And the researchers looked at 7,000 different articles, and their conclusion was that they all came up with a different kind of approach, a different definition. So I think in terms of the challenge, one of the things that I'm looking at trying to do is to find a locally agreed definition of inclusion, because it's almost impossible to think about the raft of different contexts that we have across Wales, the UK, wider, and suggest that the same thing would apply everywhere. I think what we have got is a kind of strong moral imperative, but we also need to be able to measure that a little bit and be a bit accountable to it, and to be able to say, actually, sometimes we haven't gone far enough. And we do know, there's lots of data out there that tells us that children with ALN are disproportionately excluded from schools. We know that we've got increased pressure to create specialist places. Lucy talked about how that doesn't really actually reflect a truly inclusive model. So how do we, the challenge, I think, is how do we align our aspirations and our moral imperative with the kind of practically applicable tools, skills, operational activity that we need to kind of implement that. I hope that makes sense, because it is quite challenging, and that's the kind of that's the crux of it, really.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Kate. And I think very often we are kind of focusing on our own kind of practice and our own settings, but actually looking at it on that bigger level. Like you say, I think we all have that moral imperative and want to be inclusive, but actually, do we know what that means and what it looks like? And is there that common definition, which we don't have currently? And how does that kind of look in unique settings with unique learners, with unique staffing, and so on? So thank you very much. So Lucy, same question over to you. What are the challenges you see or experience in terms of embedding inclusive practice?
Well, I was just thinking of it from an ALN code point of view, because I feel quite lucky. I've got a lot of support where I am in terms of professionals around me to even look at kind of like the IDP process. So what a good IDP looks like, what a good ALP target looks like, what provision looks like, what statutory things are we going to put in place to support the learners. So for me, from a special schools perspective, I feel quite confident to say that I would know the ALN code is on its way to being something that is really inclusive. When I go out and support other schools where you've got Elencos who potentially are also working full time, or they have very little time to be able to put this process in place, there's no admin support there, they're not really sure about how to define whether or not somebody's got an additional learning needs or not. Is it, from a powers perspective, what level are they meeting? Are they one-page profile? Are they school maintained IDPs? Are they local authority maintained IDPs? That's a huge decision to be made by those people who are working in that setting. And I do take my hat off to them, because it's not a huge amount of training and support to really unpick exactly what the ALN code looks like in those kind of mainstream schools. So I do feel really fortunate because it's very clear cut. They're in our school because they've got a local authority maintained IDP, and then it's up for me then to upskill my staff to make sure that that looks like it's really good quality and does support those learners. So I'd say that's a huge thing, a big challenge across Wales to look at. As well as that, I mentioned at the beginning, I've worked across different local authorities. So different local authorities interpret it in very different ways. And they provide school with guidance. Some of it's statutory, some of it doesn't feel statutory. And actually, my job then as a leader is to take the kind of guidance we're given and transfer that into a policy. So we end up then having a huge amount of policies that need to be implemented within the school. So again, you could have a watered down version of what kind of local authority looks like or Welsh Government looks like into a school that then is being embedded not in the way that everybody else's vision is. So that also can filter down the way in which we're inclusive within our settings. So in particular, I was thinking of even like the word exclusion. So what exclusion means that one local authority means something very different to another local authority, and then the interpretation to school is very different, and then the interpretation between staff is very different. So you can see there's a huge amount of challenges within school. As well as that, you've also got the Curriculum for Wales challenges. And I said to you quite often, we are very much a missing gap. If you're not progression step 1, where are you? And the amount of outreach I'm doing in primary schools in particular, you've got learners coming through that are working, they're in year 1, year 2, but they're presenting as reception kind of age, early years, development age, etc. So we've got a load of learners who are actually quite missing the gap in terms of Curriculum for Wales. So when there is even statutory guidance out there for us to be able to monitor in the school, there's a huge mission gap around this kind of specialist provision that's really needed for our learners in Wales. And on top of that, then you've got lots of staff then who are literally juggling so many things. When I talk about holistic, I really mean holistic. But we are now picking up the pieces and expected to pick up the pieces. Is this person's now on a bland diet or they're not eating at all? What are you going to do with it from a school's perspective? What I'll do is I'll phone health, and there is no health always available. So there are huge challenges around that. Social services stretched to their limit. Physiotherapies, OTs, all of those people who you really do need to be part of that discussion are really stretched to their limit. And again, I'm really lucky in special school settings. I book in regular slots with healthcare professionals. And I know full well that there are very few and far between seen within mainstream settings. So there are a huge amount of challenges around putting policy into practice within special schools. So it's great having it there, but the interpretation needs to be there and everybody needs to be singing from the same hymn sheet to move forward.
Lovely, thank you very much, Lucy. So even though on a different level to what Kate was talking about, a lot of crossover there in terms of interpretation and vision, and again links perhaps to some of the ESTIN evaluations of recent ALN implementation in terms of challenges around resourcing, challenges around inconsistent definition and how those are implemented into practice, and actually what do we mean by the term ALN and additional learning provision, which has been quite challenging in places. So far then, both of you have shared some incredible in-depth experiences, incredible in-depth points of views and perspectives in terms of inclusion. So I'm going to ask you one final question, but then before we move on to a slightly different topic, thinking about professional development. So this is quite a hard question to answer potentially because you've both said so much, and I think I'm going to come to Lucy first in terms of this one. So as we get into kind of the final 15 minutes or so of the Ask the Expert session for today, what would be your 3 top takeaway points that you would like to leave us with in relation to inclusive practice?
Okay, so mine's not going to be completely off ball, very simple. First one is look within. So look within, and like I keep mentioning, the 3 enablers. Is there something within your practice, within your school setting that you need to do to change your environment, to change your adults' views and opinions, or upskill adults around it, and to look at your experiences you're giving learners? So top number 1 is look within. Is there something that you can do to be more inclusive within your setting, or as an individual, or as a whole cohort? The second one is normalize the word quirky. And this I'm really passionate about that. We're all quirky. I think people forget we all have different triggers, different ways that we manage. We're all very good at self-regulating, but a lot of people feel different. You talk to children all about, I feel different than everybody else. I need to sit in a different room. I have got a diagnosis, etc. The whole point of the IDP process is to give you a formulation of what that child needs. That we don't no longer need to have that official stamp diagnosis. It doesn't matter that child's got autism. What does that actually mean? That means nothing to us in schools. Normalize differences because we're all different. So that's my second one. And then my third one then is, again, just I'm really harping home, think about that child holistically. How can you educate somebody if they've only had 2 hours sleep last night? How can you educate somebody if actually the whole point around their education is that child needs to be able to learn how to share with another pupil? Use the curriculum to wrap around the child's needs. Don't use the curriculum to make the child fit. So the third thing was about think about that child holistically and co-regulate with them and co-educate with them at the same time.
Lovely, thank you very much, Lucy. So lovely points to take away with there. Think about looking within, look at those enablers within settings, normalise and appreciate difference, and think about those learners on a holistic level, and it's not just about the academic deal about. Thank you. So Kate, over to you. What would be your 3 key takeaway points you'd like us to leave with today?
Sure, thank you. So similar in some respects as you'd expect. So the first point would be around inclusion's everybody's business, and thinking about the social model of disability, really embedding that in your practice. It's very hard sometimes when you're an individual practitioner, but I think, you know, sometimes we're very we get quite hung up on labels, on what we can refer to as really othering children, or children having something additional. As Lucy says, really it's about we're all different and we're all the same, and our responsibility as professionals is really to think that's my business, that's my responsibility. I need to make this work for whoever's sat in front of me. That's our kind of, like, you know, moral imperative. I think the second point, and it's really hard because these are tough jobs that everybody is doing, but I think, you know, never giving up, and never giving up on being inclusive, because it can be easier to be inclusive until it gets hard. So until you know, that's the point when it really becomes true inclusion, actually, is when it gets quite difficult, when the behaviour can be perceived as quite challenging, when the learning need is quite difficult to address. That's the bit when we have a responsibility to say, I need some help, I need to get some expertise in, I need to, like, think about my practice. So yeah, never giving up. And what goes hand in hand with that is asking for help and asking for support and guidance. And then the third point, again, similarly to Lucy, but would be to don't be afraid to innovate and to do something different, to change a practice. Think about being ready for the child rather than the child being ready for your classroom or your setting. And if you need to do something different to change that, to kind of move things around, don't be afraid to do that. So they're my 3 key takeaways, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. So very much thinking about responsibility, very much thinking about practitioner resilience, and I really like that last point as well. Make yourself ready for the child rather than the child to fit in with the setting. So the final question that we're going to touch on shortly very much does link to something that Christina was talking about in session 1 before this session about professional development, and it's something that both of you have alluded through in different ways to today. So Kate, you've already started to give us a little bit of a background. Lucy, you used the phrase along the lines of, you know what, I went away and taught myself about how to work with some of the learners that I was working with. So I'm going to word this slightly differently because I'm annoying to the question that had been sent, but both of you are very much involved in and engaged with professional development opportunities, as well as you've shown today, being expert practitioners within your area of practice as well. So what we'd just like you to do over the next 5-6 minutes or so as we draw towards the end of this session is to give you a little bit of an opportunity to share with us in terms of recent or current or ongoing professional development opportunities that you've engaged with. What are those, and how do you think those might impact on your practice? So I think I'm going to come to you, Kate, first of all, in terms of that, if you're happy to give us a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll talk about my experience on the doctoral program, if that's okay. So what I was struggling with a little bit in terms of professional development was finding the development that really worked for me. So I talked about kind of, the not giving up and the innovating, and I was probably getting a little bit frustrated in terms of not being able to find something that really supported me to meet some of the really significant challenges. So, working in the kind of fields around ALN, EOTUS, there isn't anything that really is kind of bespoke to that, and doesn't really kind of it was raising more questions, I suppose, for me than it was answers. So the opportunity arose to apply for the national EdD, and I've shared with my cohort. We've got an ALN group who are like, it's like finding your tribe. It's wonderful because all of a sudden I met these people who like spoke my language and thought like me, and I was like, oh, it's brilliant. I'm not going mad. These people really understand, the kind of problems, the challenges. It was 12 years since I did my master's. I didn't do the national MA. I did actually quite a different route. I did a bizarre combination of leadership and management and teaching English as additional language. We need more than an hour to explain why that came about, but I won't bore you with that. But what really appealed about the doctoral program was this opportunity to kind of really tailor my research to the problems and the challenges that I was kind of experiencing in my own work area. So we're just about to submit our research proposals, and I've been looking at inclusive education and how ALNet has what kind of impact that has had in terms of supporting or otherwise schools to become inclusive organizations. And I think some of the things that we've talked about this morning are really the kind of, the crux of the challenges is that we have a really kind of like strong desire to be inclusive practitioners, to have work within inclusive organizations, but we don't have a very definitive framework that allows us to do that. So even with ALNet as a piece of legislation, what we've seen, and it's been in the news this week, the outcomes from the national review, is that actually it doesn't actually tell us what we should be doing. It doesn't give us that kind of like really definitive benchmark around these are non-negotiables and these are nice to haves and these are, you don't need to worry about that. So my professional learning, my own professional learning has been exploring some of that and kind of, having the luxury, I guess, through the EdD of being able to do the research to unpick some of the challenges. It was quite reassuring to find out that this is like a kind of, internationally challenging problem. So, that made me feel a bit better, that it wasn't just me or just my organization struggling with it, but also the opportunity to kind of hopefully take that forward and then undertake some research to really find out, like, operationally how we can look at perhaps a local definition. So look at something that will work within our own specific context. If we haven't got it regionally, nationally, I think we can potentially have it locally, so that we have our own definition, our own non-negotiables, and that hopefully that will help support practitioners, but ultimately, give better outcomes, better opportunities for our learners to make the progression that they really want to do. Although we do have some, like, honestly really wonderful stuff happening. It's incredible, what does happen in schools. They're miracle workers, really. But that should happen by design, not by accident. So.
Thank you very much for sharing what you're currently looking at with us. And then same question then over to Lucy.
Yeah, so if I look at my kind of career, I was always been like the Pied Piper, and all those children that people used to almost be in the corridor children, I'd say, used to follow me. And I in a special school, we had a certain corridor that used to lock. It's one of those ones that lock immediately after you enter. So I was given a class that they were a challenge, should I say. And then one day, one of the people in the intervention team said to me, well, what we just need to do is just get out of your head how you work with somebody and get it onto paper. And that kind of set me a bit of, well, how am I going to do that? I don't know what I do differently. And I just presumed that as a teacher, I was just doing what everybody else did. And then when I became head of department, those Pied Piper children followed me as the head of departments, and I made changes across the department that made a difference. And now, obviously, as a senior leader, I'm doing it again. So at that time, when somebody put that idea in my head, also the national MA came out. So I was the first cohort to go on. I thought, right, I'm going to apply for it. I've got older children now. What am I going to do? And I would say, honestly, the first year in particular was just such a challenge. I was learning words that didn't even know existed in the kind of English dictionary. Paradigm, ontology. I thought, I have no idea what it is. So the first year really took a long time for me to kind of understand academic writing and to kind of get me into that academic way of thinking. But I can honestly say that, Di, you know how bad it was, especially in the dissertation. It was very, very challenging for me, but it really did completely change my mindset and view and my practice. So I would say, as a result of the MA, I now see things from a completely different lens I didn't even know existed. I know how to measure things. I know how to work where the missing gaps are. Research for me is, I'm hugely passionate about research, but actually resting upon different types of research and how to ensure that staff also look at it from a research perspective. So what's already out there? Why are we reinventing the wheel? Where are the gaps? That really made my inquiry brain start ticking over, and I'm really I lead on inquiry within our school setting as well across all classes. So the MA really changed my mindset and really gave me a good solid foundation. And one of the questions I asked my dissertation is, was there need for a toolkit to be used within every setting to help you with challenging behaviour, so that staff can go to, like, we're not trained in behaviour, we're trained in education, but is there somewhere that staff needed to go to say, I'm really struggling with this pupil, and how do I overcome these challenging behaviours? So my MA identified there was a need for the toolkit. So I was like, great, I've answered it. Job's done. And then the ED came out, and I was like, right, well, what happens if I actually implement this toolkit then? How am I going to measure how effective it is? So that's what my current proposal is I then jump back into it. I always said I'd never do it again. I've told all my friends off for not talking me out of it. But I've got a real passion for research informed approaches within school. I want to make changes. There's obviously huge missing gaps within our sector. We haven't got it right all the time. All the national press shows us we haven't got it right in terms of challenging behaviours as it is. But actually, there are some right approaches that are just not put in one place. So my new proposal now is very research informed around taking my learning deeper. So what do I do next? So now I know it's here. What do I do next? So there is kind of when the deadline's done, Kate and I will be smiling, but we've got another week and a half to get it all in and finish it off. But I really, really am so thirsty for more. I'm thirsty for more research. I'm thirsty for more ideas. I'm thirsty to listen to practitioners. I'm thirsty to look at the impact that it has on learners. I'm thirsty to fill in those missing gaps and make education better, because surely isn't that why we're here? We're here to make this the best industry we can possibly do. So that's my professional development. As long as that, doing a full-time job and being a full-time mum, you just balance it, because actually this is your passion. This is why we're all here on the MA programme, is you're passionate about making change for the better. And you just find ways of slotting it all in on top of all the other professional development you do within school. And that's where I am currently.
Thank you very much. And the reason why we've asked Kate and Lucy that question really is very much that many of you on the call today, you are at the start of your kind of professional development journey in terms of this. We used that word journey in the introduction session today about introducing your journey through the module. As I said earlier on, not only are Kate and Lucy experts in terms of what they do in practice, but I think are clear role models, passionate, enthusiastic, interested, inquisitive in terms of this area, and does give the opportunity to show those potential those potential career progression and development routes from the kind of the national MA. By the way, it was a fantastic experience, not challenging working with you on your dissertation, Lucy. I just wanted to add that, and thinking about potential next steps going forward. So thank you very much for being open and honest and sharing where you've come from today and where you're hoping to go with that next as well. So I am really conscious of time that we've come up to 1 o'clock, and I don't want to keep you any longer than we have to on your kind of one day of the week off on a Saturday, and we are coming up towards our lunchtime as well today. So on behalf of everyone this morning, can I just say diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much indeed for being so open and sharing with us this morning. And could I please ask, as a show of support, as some people are doing already, if you are happy to kind of click on the react button and give Lucy and Kate what is quite a cheesy online virtual round of applause to show our appreciation. Diolch yn fawr iawn in terms of that. We may have a final minute or so if people are happy to stay on. I will just open up. Is there anyone that wants to jump in with a very quick question for Lucy and or Kate before we pause for lunch? If you do, please just unmute yourself and shout away.